Today's daf is Yevamos daf Gimel, and we are 7 lines from the bottom of daf Beis Amud Beis, the beginning of the Gemara Mechdi. Today's daf's being learned Le'ilu Nishmas Shlomo ben Yibadal Chaim Tovim Reb Chaim Doiv, and as a schus refuah shalema for Avadia ben Miriam Leah, Moshe Abba ben Devora bas Mecha, Shmuel ben Tehila, Elazar Lipa Shalom ben Fega Rachel, Sarah Nechama bas Rus Malka, Baruch ben Rachel, Malka Miriam bas Esther, and Esther Kreindel bas Devora. Today's that's also being learned Le'ilu Nishmas Doiv Beryl ben Reb Yaakov David. So yesterday, Be'ezras Hashem, we began a new Masechta, a new Seder Nashim Mesechtes Yevamos. Daf Beis of Mesechtes Yevamos, from a Daf Yomi perspective, is the first Mishna in the Masechta. Daf Gimel is going to be an analysis of the key points of the first Mishnah of Mesechtes Yevamos. So before we begin the Gemara, I believe it's Kedai to just recap the Mishnah so that Be'ezras Hashem will segue into today's daf, which is not just another daf in the Masechta, but in many ways is an introductory daf. So the first few dafim of Mesechtes Yevamos are very critical in terms of establishing just the basic yesodis that we have to have in order for us to be able to go through Mesechtes Yevamos in a streamlined way. So Mesechtes Yevamos begins with 6 psukim in the Torah and Parshas Kiseitze. It says in the Torah, Ki yeshvu achim yachdav. There's going to be 2 brothers that were living together. Umeis achad mehem. One of them died. He left over no children. Zok the Torah, although this person's wife is now an almana, and an almana ordinarily is allowed to go marry anyone that she wants, this woman is different. She's not allowed to just go marry anyone. Rather, the Yavam, meaning the brother that's alive, has a mitzvah to marry this woman. What's the tachlis of this mitzvah? Says the Torah, by him marrying this woman, hopefully they'll have children, and through the children, Yakum al Shem Achav Ames, there'll be a hemshach for the soul, for the neshama of this person that died without children. We mentioned the Ramban in Parshas Vayeshev that says that the soid of Yibum is one of the soides hakdolim that's mentioned in the Torah. And although the Ramban himself is not the farish in the Parshas Vayeshev, what he means, but what the Ramban is referring to is the concept of Gilgul Neshamas, so that somehow, in the event that a Yibum is going to take place, the neshama of the achames will be reincarnate in any child that's born, and as a result, this child will have a hemshach. Stating that, the Torah says that if the Yavam chooses not to do Yibum, he doesn't have to. There's a mitzvah to do Yibum, but he's not obligated to do it. What does the Yavam do in the event that he chooses not to do Yibum? In the event he's going to choose not to do it, for also etc. He has a mitzvah to do chalitza. So the basic concept of Yibum is there are 2 brothers. One of them is married. He died, left over no children. There's a mitzvah for the brother that's alive to be miyabim, which means to marry the Eshes Hames, to marry his brother's almana. The tachlis is to have children. Through the children that the alive brother is going to have, there will be a hemshach for the achames. What happens if the brother chooses not to do yibum? Then there's a mitzvah of chalitz. Stating that, as we mentioned yesterday, there are many situations of a brother dying, leaving over no children, there being a brother that's alive, and yet there's not going to be a mitzvah of yibum. The most classic and most prominent of those cases is the first Mishnah and the first Sugi Mesechtes Yevamos, and that is where the Yevama, the wife of the brother that died, was an erva to the Yavam. In that case, there's no mitzvah of Yibum. In that case, there's no mitzvah of Chalitza. So what is the exact case? And just to use names, to play it out a little bit, Reuven and Shimon were brothers. Reuven was married, he died, he left over no children. Reuven's wife was an erva to Shimon. The Mishnah gave 15 examples of how that could be possible. But Reuven is married to a woman that's an erva to Shimon. If Reuven dies, leaves over no children, although ordinarily, based on the psukim in the Torah, it says Yevama Yava Yoleh, you would think that there would be a mitzvah of Yibum, but being that Reuven's almana is an erva to Shimon, there's not going to be a mitzvah of Yibum. Not only is there going to be no mitzvah of Yibum, there's going to be no mitzvah of Chalitza as well. Meaning there's no Yibum, there's no Chalitza, there's no Isser of Leisiya, Eshes Ames Achutza Lishzar. The entire parsha of Yibum is not going to be applicable. That's the first Chiddush that the Mishnah said. But the Mishnah mentioned another Chiddush. What would be if Reuven had two wives? This is pre-Cheru de Rabbeinu Gershon, where it was very feasible that Reuven that died left over not one wife, but rather two wives. Now, one of the wives was an Erva to Shimon, but the other wife was not an Erva to Shimon. Says the Mishnah, just like there's no Yibum and there's no Chalitza for the Erva, so too there's no Yibum and there's no Chalitza for the other woman as well. Meaning, there's no Yibum, there's no Chalitza for the Erva, and there's no Yibum, no Chalitza for the Tzara of the Erva, also known as the Tzaras Erva. So there's no Yibum, no Chalitza for an Erva, and there's no Yibum, there's no Chalitza for a Tzaras Erva. But the Mishnah said another Chiddush. The Mishnah said, what would happen if Reuven, Shimon, and Levi were brothers? Reuven had two wives. One was an Erva to Shimon, not to Levi, an Erva to Shimon, and he had another wife. Reuven died, left over no children. So now there's a mitzvah of Yibum and Chalitza. Now Shimon doesn't have a mitzvah of Yibum. Why not? Because Reuven's two wives are an Erva and a Tzaras Erva, respectively. As a result, there's no mitzvah of Yibum, there's no mitzvah of Chalitza. But Levi does have a mitzvah of Yibum and Chalitza, because Reuven's wife, that was an Erva to Shimon, was not an Erva to Levi. So Shimon's not going to have a mitzvah to do Yibum and Chalitza, because Erva and Tzaras Erva. Levi, however, is going to have a mitzvah to do Yibum and Chalitza. What happens if Levi did Yibum? Levi did Yibum not with the woman that was an Erva to Shimon, but rather with the woman that was the Tzaras Erva to Shimon. So Levi is now married to Reuven's Tzaras Erva via Yibum. Levi had another wife, and then Levi died. And he left over no children. So that Levi's two wives now fell a Yibum to Shimon. Now, who are the two wives? One of them was the Tzaras Erva from Reuven's marriage. The other one wasn't ever married to Reuven, is Levi's other wife. The halacha is that Shimon does not have a mitzvah of Yibum or a mitzvah of Chalitza with the woman that was Reuven's Tzaras Erva. And the reason is because being that she was a Tzaras Erva the first time she fell a Yibum to Shimon, even though now she's not technically a Tzaras Erva anymore, because Tzaras Erva is not a Metzias, it's more, she's the Tzara of the Erva. So in Reuven's marriage, she was the Tzara of the Erva. But in Levi's marriage, she's not the Tzara of the Erva. It doesn't matter. Once a Tzaras Erva, forever a Tzaras Erva. And the halacha is, there's going to be no Yibum, there's going to be no Chalitza on the woman that's a Tzaras Erva. Once we establish it, there's no Yibum and there's no Chalitza with the woman that's a Tzaras Erva, there's also going to be no Yibum and no Chalitza with the other woman either. Why? Because she's not an Erva, and she's not a Tzaras Erva, but what she is a Tzaras Erva. She's the Tzara of the Tzaras Erva. Regardless, the Mishnah said there's no Yibum, no Chalitza with an Erva. There's no Yibum, there's no Chalitza with a Tzaras Erva. There's also no Yibum and no Chalitza with the Tzara of a Tzaras Erva. What would be if there were four brothers, and now the Tzaras Erva would fall the Yibum again with another Tzara? So that woman, just to confuse this, would be the Tzara of the Tzaras Erva. It would be the same halacha. And what if she had a Tzara? It would also be the same halacha. That's what the Mishnah means when it says the words Ad Soifa Olam. Meaning, this in theory, all you have to do is add a brother, another person has to die, and there's another wife in the picture. You can come up with as many cases as you want. You can take this formula, drag it across the spreadsheet, and have as many cases as necessary. But the fundamental principle is this: Erva, Tzaras Erva, and Tzaras Erva, Ad Soifa Olam. That was the first part of the Mishnah. Today's daf is going to, at the end of the daf, bring the Makairis. How we know that there's no Yibum, there's no Chalitza with an Erva. How we know that there's no Yibum, no Chalitza with a Tzaras Erva. How we know that there's no Yibum and there's no Chalitza with the Tzara of a Tzaras Erva. Today's daf is also going to discuss some technical questions related to the Mishnah. Today's daf is going to be #NoRaid. The objective is just to try to get some of these Yisoidis a little bit more clearly. Again, Yevamos Daf Gimel is a very important daf in terms of just laying the groundwork to some of the Gemaras that we're going to get into. As Hashem, tomorrow we'll start getting into some of the Lumdis and some of the Raid as we get into some of the real Geshmaki Gemaras here in the Masechtas Yevamos. Either way. So the Mishnah began by mentioning Chamesh Esrei Nashim, 15 arayas, where you have the halacha of Erva and Tzaras Erva and Tzaras Erva with regards to Yibum the Chalitza. And then the Mishnah gave the list of the 15 arayas: Bitoy, bas bitoi, bas benoi. So a person's daughter, his daughter's daughter, son's daughter. Bas ishtoi, bas benoi, bas bita. His wife's daughter, his wife's son's daughter, and his wife's daughter's daughter. Chamoisai, his shviger. The aim chamoisai, shviger's mother. The aim cham of his shver's mother. Achoisai me'imoi, his maternal sister. Va'achois imoi, his mother's sister. Va'achois ishtoi, his wife's sister. Ve'ishes achiv me'imoi, his maternal brother's wife. Ve'ishes achiv shloi hoya ba'ilama. Talked about that. The Kalosai and his daughter-in-law. So these were the 15 arayas where if any one of these 15 arayas were married to a person's brother and then that brother dies and left over no children, the halach is, you'd have the halach of erva, tsaras erva, and tsaras erva. Now it's important to note that when we talk about arayas, so not all arayas were created equally. So an erva is a woman that a man is not allowed to live with. But there are many women that are not arayas that a man is not allowed to live with. An erva is unique in the sense that not only is it asur for there to be a bia with arayas, but there's an isser for the person to marry that woman. That's obvious. More importantly, if he marries her, the kedushin is not going to be chal. So when we talk about arayas are not just isurei bia, but arayas are so removed from the issues that if a man would say with an erva, the kedushin actually wouldn't be chal. The reason it wouldn't be chal is because all arayas are chayve krisos. If someone's mezana with an erva, there's a chi of krisos, and the halacha is that any time there's a chi of krisos or a oynish of kares between man and woman, in the event that there would be a bia, the halacha is that marriage doesn't have the ability to go into effect. Stating that the oynish of all the arayas are not the same. Specifically, as it relates to the list that we have in our Mishna, this is just important as one final introductory comment, is the Mishna mentioned 15 arayas. The first 9 that were mentioned in the Mishnah, the first 9 arayas that were mentioned in the Mishnah, bitoi, ubas benoi, bas ishtoi, ubas benoi, bas bito, chamoise ve'im chamav. So the first 9, the oynish is sreifa. Once upon a time, Mezid, Edom, and Asra, Bezdin would give the person that violated this erva sreifa. The next 5 that were mentioned, Achoisoi me'imoi, v'achois imoi, v'achois ishtoi, v'eishes achiv me'imoi, v'eishes achiv shloi hoya ba'ilomoi. There, the oynish would be simply kares. And finally, Kalosa, your daughter-in-law, that was the 15th erva that was mentioned in the Mishnah, the oynish would be skila. So even though they're all arayos, and they all have in common the fact that kedushin is not going to be toifas, but at the same time, as it relates to the particular oynish is going to be different. Specifically, as it relates to our Mishnah, again, we're just working with the 15 we have in our Mishnah. The first 9 are sreifa, and then the next 5 are going to be kares, and then the 15th, the last one is going to be skila. So on that note, Zok the Gemara, mech. It's a little bit of a sneak preview. We're going to see at the end of the daf that the makar to the halacha, that there's no yibam and there's no chalitza with an erva and with a tsaras erva and with a tsaras erva. It's learned out from one of the arayas in the Torah, specifically achos isha. It's learned from the fact that if a person's wife's sister would fall yibam, being that she's an erva, so there'd be no halacha of yibam b'chalitza. So the makar, as we will see at the end of the daf, to the halacha of erva and tsaras erva is achos isha. So if the makar took this halacha of our Mishnah is achos isha, listen, achos isha b'reisha. So why did the Mishnah, when it listed the 15 arayas, why did it start with bitoi and first mention achos isha a little bit later? It should have started with achos isha. Achos isha is the makar. That is the source to this halacha. So wouldn't it seem reasonable that if somebody was being the side of the Mishnah, he would have said, okay, I have to list 15 arayas. I could just list them randomly, or there could be a little cheshbon. There could be a method to the way it's being listed. Assuming there would be a method, which you would think, so achos isha would seem to be the one that should be mentioned first, because achos isha is the makar. So the Gemara, you'll tell me, maybe the reason the Mishnah didn't mention achos isha first is because, like we just mentioned now, the 15 arayas that I mentioned in the Mishnah can be grouped into 3 different categories in terms of what the oynish is. 9 of them are sreifa, 5 of them are kares, and then 1 of them is skila. So maybe the Tana and the Mishnah is listing it in order of which erva has the most chamur oynish. Okay, for Rav Shimoni, you would have to say that the Mishnah is going to Rav Shimoni, the Amma Sreifa Chamura, who holds that Sreifa is the most chamur of all the Arba Misas Besen. So we know there's Arba Misas Besen. Skila, Sreifa, Hereg, and Chenek. It's Machlekes Reb Shimon and the Chachamim, which is the most Chamer. The Chachamim say Skila is the most Chamer. Reb Shimon holds Sreifa is the most Chamer. So look, the Gemara, maybe the reason the Mishnah mentioned Bitoi first, because the Oynish for Bitoi is Sreifa, and being that the Oynish for Bitoi is Sreifa. So therefore, we're mentioning it first because we want to go in order of which erva is Oynish is the most Chamer. And by the way, it's not just Bitoi that's Sreifa. We said it's the first line that has Sreifa. So being that the first line has Sreifa, so maybe that's the reason we're mentioning it first. Meaning, you're right. There's a svara to argue that Achos Isha should be mentioned first, because Achos Isha is the makar to the halacha in the Mishnah. Then maybe the Tana chose to go in a different direction. Again, there's a method. As long as it's a method, the Gemara is going to be okay. We just don't want it to be random. So you would think Achos Isha should be first. Right here, nice. Maybe, but we went in another way. We decided we're going to go in order of what's the most chamer. And the most chamer is Sreifa, because the time of the Mishnah Reb Shimon holds that Sreifa is chamura. And therefore, we started with the first line, which are all Sreifa. Abazak the Gemara, I have two problems with this. Number one, what should have been mentioned first is chamoisa. Mother-in-law should have been first. Why? The ikas Sreifa b'chamoisa ksiva. Because it's true that all the first 9 arayos mentioned in the Mishnah all have an oynish of Sreifa, but the makar to all 9 comes from chamoisai. I mean that the makar comes from chamoisai. We're mentioning it because it's Sreifa, and the makar is chamoisai, which is Sreifa. So you would think chamoisai should be mentioned first. But another problem is basa chamoisai listening kalasai. Kalasai should have been 10th. After the first 9, we should have mentioned kalasai. The basa Sreifa, skila chamura, because after Sreifa comes skila. Because the Mishnah really mentioned 3 categories of einshin. We mentioned Sreifa, we mentioned karis, and we mentioned skila. Now, Sreifa is chamura. Say that after Sreifa, if it's between skila and karis, it's going to be skila. Why? Because karis is considered less chomer than any one of the dal misas bezin. It's certainly less chomer than skila, which is the second most chomer. So why are we going 9 Sreifa and then 5 karis and then 1 skila? If the cheshbon of the order is kana chumri chumri nakat, we're going in order of what's most chomer. So number 1, we should have started with chamois. And besides, even after we mentioned the 9 Sreifas, we should have mentioned the 1 skila. So kalasai should have been number 10 as opposed to number 15. As I phrase the Gemara, Ella. So the Gemara says maybe the reason the Mishnah mentioned it in the order that it mentioned is not because we're going in the order of what's the most chomer. Ella, it's a different reason. Bita even the asim midrasha chavivla. It's because the Tana of the Mishnah had a special chavivos to the halacha that bita is an erva. Now, why? It's because it's not mefurish in the Torah that bita is an erva. It's only learned out from a drasha. It's a din deraisa, but it's learned out from a drasha. Teresh about that, and because it's learned out from a drasha, so the Tana and the Mishnah had a geshmak in it, right? There was a rape bite associated with it. It was geshmak. There was some of this. It had to come onto a drasha. It's before in the Torah. Okay, it's before in the Torah. But this is chavivale because this came through a drasha. It came through a melos, and because it came through a drasha, therefore the Tana and the Mishnah wanted to start with bitay because it's chavivale. And when somebody's chaviv to a person, so there's an idea of achra and achra chaviv, but there's also an idea that sometimes if something's chavivale, you actually want to start with it. Now, just before we even go weiter, so you're going to say bita is not befurish in the Torah. If you open up a chumash and Yevamos Sedra Parshas Achrim Mois, bita is befurish in the Torah. So it is befurish in the Torah. What do you mean it's not befurish in the Torah? So if you look carefully in the pasuk mentions bita, but the pasuk mentions a situation of bita where this girl is not only the man's daughter, but it's also his wife's daughter. So it's his daughter, but it's also the daughter of his wife. So he's married and they had a daughter, which is usually the way it would be. But what happens if a person has a daughter outside of marriage? It was bitoy me'anu sasai. In that case, it's not befurish in the Torah that the halacha is that this bas is going to be an erva. Now, it is an erva. It's not disputable, but it's only an erva based on drasha. And because it's based on drasha, so it's chavivale. So the Mishnah mentioned bitoy because bitoy means bitoy, even if it's me'anu sasai. And bitoy me'anu sasai is learned that midrasha. So maybe that's the reason I mentioned it. But the Gemara says it's not mistaba. That would be the reason why. Because kulu nami midrasha also. Because the truth is, really, all 15 arayos in our Mishnah are something that should have been very, very chaviv to the Tana of the Mishnah. Why? Because it's all learned out midrasha. What does the Gemara mean? If the Tana of the Mishnah was simply listing the arayos, then you would say, oh yeah, all the arayos mentioned we know. Bitoy, me'anusasa is something that we wouldn't have otherwise known. It's midrasha, therefore it's chavivale, and that's why the time of the Mishnah wanted to mention it. I hear, very nice. The problem is, our Mishnah is not just listing arayos. Our Mishnah is mentioning a halacha in Hilchas Yibam v'Chalitza. I was saying that an Erva and a Tzaras Erva and a Tzaras Erva are Patim and Yibam and a Chalitza. That is a Chiddush regardless of which Erva we're talking about. So I mean that's a Chiddush regardless of which Erva we're talking about. Miman of Shach, that Rayas mentioned in the Mishnah should be Chaviv to the time of the Mishnah. And if that's the case, we should be Makdim Bitoy over any one of the other Rayas. Because the same Chabibus that the time of the Mishnah has to say Bitoy, you should have to mention all the Arayas. Because really all the Arayas are a Chiddush in our Mishnah. If we're simply listing the Arayas and a Chinami, but we're not simply listing the Arayas. We're mentioning the Arayas in the context of a halacha that's a Chiddush, which is learned down Midrasha, which should be Chaviv to the time. So why are we picking on Bitoy? Bitoy should be first. So the Gemara says a Pashut Teretz, because Neidel in Yibun Asi Midrasha, it's true. As it relates to Yibun, all the Arayas are learned down Midrasha, and as a result is Chaviva. But the Ikar is the fact that these Arayas are Arayas. That's before in the Torah. Bitoy, however, as it relates to Bitoy, Ikar Isura Midrasha, not only is the fact that it's Patim and Yibun V'Chalitza Drasha, but Ikar Isur, the fact that Bitoy Mianusasa is even an Arab is something we know Midrasha. Damar Rava, what's the Drasha? Amud Rabbi Yitzchak Bar Avdimi. Rava said Rabbi Yitzchak Bar Avdimi told me what the Drasha is. He said Asya Heina Heina. It's based on Gzeir Shava Heina Heina. Asya Zima Zima, and it's based on another Gzeir Shava Zima Zima. Rashi explains exactly what the two Gzeir Shavas are. Ayin Sham. The short version is Heina Heina is the makar that Bita Mianusasa is an erva. Zima Zima is a makar that you have the oynish that you have for all Arayas, but as it relates to Bita Mianusasa. But the bottom line is Achti Gemara. You want to know why we mentioned Bita first? What was the kasha? L'chura, you should have started with Achisisha, being that the makar to the halacha and the Mishnah is Achisisha. So shouldn't we have started with Achisisha? So the Gemara says, yeah, in theory, we could have started with Achisisha. We decided instead to start with Bita. Why? What's the svara to start with Bita? Because the whole Cheftza of the erva of Bitoy, albeit when it's me'anu sasai, is learned out midrasha, heina heina zima zima. As a result, it's chavivale, it's chaviv to the Tana. That's what the Tana wanted to start with. It's now that you're telling me that the reason the Tana Mishnah started with Bitoy is because it was very chaviv. So if that's the case, listening l'achris the Messiah, shouldn't we have mentioned achris last? I mean, it sounds like the seder of the Mishnah is we're going to mention what's most chaviv first. Probably we should then mention what's least chaviv last. What's the most chaviv? Bitoy. Why? Because the erva of Bita Me'anusasa is something that I only know midrasha. What's the least chaviv? The Gemara is arguing Achisisha should be the least chaviv. Why? Because Achisisha, number one, the fact that it's an erva is mefurish in the Torah, and number two, even the fact that there's no yibam and no chalitza, side by the erva and side by the tzaras erva, although it's not mefurish in the Torah, but when the Torah mentions it by Achisisha. Everything else is only learned out from Achisisha. So it sounds like the gather is like this. We want to mention what's most chaviv. What's most chaviv? What's learned out from the most drushes? What's learned out from the most drushes? Pita me'anusase. What's learned out from the least drushes? Achisisha. Pita me'anusase is learned out from the most drusha because I need a drusha to teach me that it's an erva. And even once I know that it's an erva, I need a drusha to learn it from Achisisha so that I know that an erva is patam and even b'chalitza. Achisisha has the least drasha because Achisisha, number one, the etzim erva is not something I need to learn, come out from a drasha, and even the fact that I know there's a ptur even b'chalitza, it says it by Achisisha, right? All 14 other arayas that I mentioned in the Mishnah, we know the ptur even b'chalitza from Achisisha. That means there's one extra drasha that I have by those 14 that I have by Achisisha. I have to come on to learn it from Achisisha. It's afraid to Gemara. If the reason we're mentioning Pitay first is because it's Asma Midrash and Mevetz Chavivale, so based on that methodology, Achisisha should have been last, and it wasn't mentioned last. So the Gemara says no. Like I'll tell you, we mentioned Pitay first because it's Asma Midrash. The kasha was you should mention Achisisha last. That's not a kasha. I did the Isser Achvisa Tane Achisisha. It could be the Tana of the Mishnah started with Bitay, and then eventually it started talking about Achoisai, Achoisai Me'imai, Achois Imai. So once we mention the concept of an erva that's related to a sister, like a person's sister, a person's mother's sister. So then we mentioned already the next erva that's related to a sister, a person's wife's sister. We're talking about shvesters. So we mentioned all the arayas that are related to shvesters. That's basically the point of the Mishnah. So you're right. In theory, you could have mentioned Achisisha last. It would have made sense. Certainly very, very rational. But there's another approach you can go. Again, there's a mahalach over here. I mean that there's a mahalach. So why wouldn't this could be what's going on? But the Gemara says it's not a good enough answer. It's not. It doesn't work. You know why? Because if really there's a svara to mention Achisisha last, the only reason you didn't mention Achisisha last is because once you mention shvesters, you mention sisters, some in Mela. We're going to mention all the arayos that are related to sisters. So just mention that whole set at the end. Let the last three be achois me'imai, achois imai, and achois ishtoi. And like this, it's actually kind of Number one, you'll mention achois ishtoi together with the other arayos that talk about sisters. And number two, it's going to be the last arrow. So the Gemara says, because of this, it's not mistaber that the reason Bita was mentioned first is because Kivan the Asi Midrasha Chaviva. Because if the Seder of the time in the Mishnah is going in order of Chavivos, just like Bita Me'anusasa is the most Chaviv, Achas Ishtoi should be the least Chaviv, and Achas Ishtoi should be last. And Achas Ishtoi is not last. It's towards the end, but it's not last. So if that's the case, it must be that the Seder of the Mishnah has nothing to do with Chaviv and less chaviv, but rather must be related to something else. So the Gemara says, "Hello." So why then did the Mishnah begin with bita? So the Gemara says as far as follows: Tana kurvi no. Tana the Mishnah was going in terms of kurva, meaning some arayas are more closely related to people than other arayas. Right? There's the closer arayas, a person's immediate family, and then there's the more distant arayas, the person's more extended family. So the time of the Mishnah would have mentioned the case of arayas, so it wanted to mention the immediate family first, and then it worked its way towards the more extended family. Okay, so Tana Bita. What would be the closest relative from all the 15 arayas mentioned in the Mishnah? It's a person's daughter. It's easy. So Bita is first. So we started off with Bita, and then we mentioned Bas Bita or Bas Benai. Daughter and granddaughter, right? That's all one. The krevei atzmai. These are all a person's krevim, and they're very, very close krevim. And once we mention his three daughters, meaning his daughter and granddaughter, so we said just like a person's daughter's daughter, and son's daughter are arayas, so to a person's wife's daughter's daughter, wife's son's daughter can be considered arayas. So that's why we go from his three to her three. And once we mention a person's wife's three daughters, lamata, daughter's daughter, and son's daughter, so then we mentioned three daughters lamayla as well. Meaning, we mentioned chamoisai, em chamoisai, to em chamav. So that's the cheshbon of the first line. Why the first line? It started off with the closest relative, and then we sort of navigated from there. So after we mentioned the first line, then we mentioned the person's sister, because that's the next closest relative. Then we mentioned all the sisters, right? His mother's sister, the krevei atzmai, right? These are his krevim. Once we mentioned sisters, which is also a sister, right? So far we understand the first 12. We're doing well. And really at this point, we should have mentioned kalasa, daughter-in-law, because daughter-in-law really would have been the next one to mention. Now, the Gemara says that we should have mentioned kalasa before Eishes Achiv Shloi Haybai Lamai, but Tosfos speaks out. It also means that we should have mentioned kalasa before the erva that's mentioned before Eishes Achiv Shloi Haybai Lamai, and that's before Eishes Achiv Me'imah. So really, kalasa should have been the next one. Why before Eishes Achiv Shloi Haybai Lamai, and why before Eishes Achiv Me'imah? The way Mishum Kurva Hu Dasir, because that is not related to kurva. It's more related to a din of the halacha of Eishes Achiv. So why didn't we mention kalasai at that point? Because again, we're talking about arayas that are related to sister. So once we mentioned arayas that are related to sister, so we mentioned already arayas that are related to brother. It's similar. It's not mamish the same sister and brother, but it's me'inyan le'inyan v'isa inyan. So Tana Eishes Achiv Lamai, the Hadar, and then at the end, Tana Kalasai, we mentioned daughter-in-law. So says the Gemara, you want to know what to say there is? We started off with the closest relative, and then we navigated from there. And like Hakol Yavel Mekanim Bashalim, and that's the reason we have the 15 that we have. Regardless, this concludes the very, very first portion of the daf. So just to recap, the Mishnah, the Gemara was discussing something very, very technical. Not the halacha of the Mishnah, not the toichin of the Mishnah, not the lumdus of the Mishnah, not the makarta of the Mishnah. Pashat the seder of the Mishnah. We mentioned 15 arayas. We just threw 15 different arayas out there, and the Gemara assumes it's not random. There must be some sort of cheshbon, and we're trying to understand what the cheshbon is. And the Gemara really began with an assumption that if you'd ask me, I would have thought the one to start with wouldn't even be bita; it would be achis ishtoi. Achis ishtoi is the makar to the halacha of the Mishnah, so it would have made sense to start with achis ishtoi. So why we start with bita? That's the Gemara's kasha, and the Gemara took 3 attempts. The first attempt is that maybe the time of the Mishnah is Reb Shimon. Reb Shimon holds Sreifa Chamura, and bita the Oynish is Sreifa, and that's why we started with bita. Gemara had a kasha on that. Then the Gemara said maybe the reason we're starting with bita is because bita is asking midrasha and it's chavivalei. The whole concept that bita specifically me'anu sasa is an erva is something that I only know midrasha. So maybe it was very chaviv to the time of the Mishnah. So the time of the Mishnah wanted to put it out there right away. He has such a geshmak in mentioning bita. Gemara had a problem with that. The Gemara says, you want to know why we started with bita? Because from all the 15 arayas that I mentioned in the Mishnah, that's the closest relative. Tana kurvi naka. And once we understand that, we can apply that through the Mishnah. We can make sense of the Seder that the Mishnah was mentioning. So moving along in the Gemara's discussion of Pashit, the language of the Mishnah. So again, we understand now the Seder of why the 15 arayos were mentioned in the order that they were mentioned. So let's go back now to the beginning of the Mishnah. The Mishnah began, Chamesh Esrei Nashim. There are 15 women, 15 arayos that are Poichnois Sareseim, the Tzares Sareseim, and the Chalitza V'nayim. With Allah is that if they fall Yibum, there's no Chalitza. If they fall Yibum together with an Erva, together with a Tzara, the Tzara is going to be deemed the Tzara's Erva, and the Tzara is also going to have no Yibum and no Chalitza. And the same would be true for the Tzara's son. Why did the Mishnah say that these 15 Nashim are Poitrois Sareseim? Listen, Oisrois. The time of the Mishnah should have said better. It should have said, not only is there a P'tur Yibam V'chalitza, but there's actually an Isser Yibam V'chalitza. Now, why would there be an Isser Yibam V'chalitza? So Rashi explains, and again, this is an idea that we should have to inculcate into our kishkes as we go through Yevamos. And that is because every single Yevama really is an erfa to the Yavam. Forget about the Chamesh Esrei Nashim that are arayos. Every single Yevama is an erfa. And the reason is, because by definition, Yibum is where there are two brothers, one brother dies, leaves over no children. There's a mitzvah for the brother that's alive, for the Yavam, to marry his brother's wife. It's an Eshazach. Eshazach is an erva. It's a Chayvei Krisos. Eshazach is an erva. Not for us. There's a mitzvah to do Yibum. And because there's a mitzvah to do Yibum, Memela, there's no Isser Eshazach. But the minute there's no mitzvah to do Yibum, that means there's no heter anymore in the Isser Eshazach. So it's Hadar Dina that the Yevama is not just exempt from the mitzvah of Yibum, but there's actually an Isser Biyah. Because now it's a Chayvei Krisos, now it's an ordinary Erva. That means if Chamesh Esrei Nashim are potter from Yibum, they're not just potter from Yibum, but Sidon Isser Yibum. And if the halach is that they're poitros Sareseim, they not only say that they themselves have no Yibum Chalitza, but the Tzara also has no Yibum Chalitza. It means not only that there's a P'tur Yibum Chalitza on the Tzara, but there's an Isser Yibum Chalitza. So if that's the case, right, the Gemara, why did the Mishnah say Sharfer? Why did the Mishnah say Poitros? It should have said Oisros. And even though we know the Tana of the Mishnah sometimes speaks B'loshen K'tzara, right? So sometimes the Tana is going to try to be very, very abbreviated, right? The Tana Mishnah talks very little. The price is much wordier. Oh, but the Mishnah is not so much. But it's one word. What's the difference if the word is Poitros or if the word is Oisros? And the Oisros is way more descriptive. Because if it's Oisros, it means there's no Yibum, there's no Chalitza, but it means much sharper than that. It means there's also an Issa. It's a fake Gemara. Why did the Tana Mishnah say there's a P'tur Yibum Chalitza? Listen to the Oisros. Because the Rega, there's no Yibum, there's an Issa Eshesach. There's an Issa Eshesach, it's Aser. So the Gemara says, Itana Oisros, at the Tana Mishnah said, Oisros, I would have thought Aser Liyah. It's true, there's an Issa to do Yibum. After Michlot Chalza. But maybe there's a mitzvah, maybe chalitza is you are supposed to do. Kamash Malan. So therefore, the Tana of the Mishnah had to say Poitros to make it clear that there's no Yibum, there's no chalitza. The Gemara says, what? The listening has to relax. No. What we mean to say is, why couldn't the Mishnah just say what it said? Chamesh Esrei Nashim, Oisrois Sareseim, but Sareseim, the chalitza v'nayibum. Say very, very clearly that there's an Issa Yibum and there's also an Issa Chalitza. The Gemara says, no, Issa Chalitza? You mean to tell me you wanted the Mishnah to say that there's an Issa Chalitza? My covet. How could there be an Issa Chalitza? Issa Yibum, yeah. Because if there's no mitzvahs Yibum, then there's an Issa Reisha Sa'ach Memel, there's an Issa Yibum. But why would there ever be an Issa Chalitza? What's the big deal? Why can a woman take off the man's shoe and then just spit and say, like, what would possibly be this? The Gemara says, no, Allah, I disagree. I think it's pashut that there's an Issa Chalitza by an Erva. You know why? Because if you're going to tell me it's mutter to do Chalitza, you might end up doing Yibum. So it's actually mistaber that there is an Issa Chalitza. It's afraid to Gemara. So why then didn't the Mishnah say Oisros? Why did the Mishnah say Poitros? So the Gemara says, I'll tell you why. Because give them Makom Mitzvah Hu Dasir Tzara. But B'Shaloi Makom Mitzvah Shaya, the whole Issa Tzaras Erva, this is going to repeat itself again in the Daf. The whole Issa of Tzaras Erva is only true by Yibum. But Shaloi Makom Mitzvah, if we're not in the context of Mitzvah, there is no din of Tzaras Erva. And to make that point clear, that's why the Tana of the Mishnah said Poitros. This is a very, very important point. It's pashut, but it's very, very important. It's so important that the Gemara mentions it twice in Yevamos Daf Gimel. So I think it definitely is worth making a big deal about. And that is, the halach of Tzaras Erva is exclusive to Yibum. The only time there's something called the Tzaras Erva is when you learn Masechtas Yevamos. If you're not learning Yevamos, if you're learning Ksubis, Gittin, and Kedushin, there's no such thing as Tzaras Erva. Tzaras Erva is an exclusive concept in the world of Yibum. Meaning, if a person has two wives, one wife is an Erva to Ploini, and the other wife is not an Erva to Ploini. There's no halacha anywhere that says that the person that this woman is an Erva to is not allowed to marry the other wife because she's a Tzaras Erva. In other words, if Reuven and Shimon weren't brothers, and Reuven had two wives, one was an Erva to Shimon, and one was not an Erva to Shimon, and then Reuven would die. There'd be no halacha that Shimon's not allowed to marry Reuven's almana, that's the Tzaras Erva. He's not allowed to marry the Erva, so maybe he shouldn't be able to marry the Tzaras Erva. The teretz is, there's no Erva called Tzaras Erva unless it's in a Yevamos context. It stopped when you're learning Masechtas Yevamos with this adin that right now there's a mitzvah in Yibum, in the parsha in Yevamos, state the halacha in Tzaras Erva. It stopped when it comes in conjunction and in tandem with the Eshazach and all the lumdis of Yevamos that we're going to get to. But the point is just Pashit Balabatish, learning the Gemara. The concept of a Tzaras Erva is only nogea in the context of two brothers, where there's an Eshazach and there's a Yevamos taking place over here. But Shloi b'Makom mitzvah, there's no such thing as a Tzaras Erva. That's very, very obvious to those that have learned Yevamos before, but the Tana of the Mishnah was afraid that that wouldn't be so obvious when you sit down and learn the first Mishnah for the first time. So the Hoitzimi Liban from people that are going to make this mistake, the Tana of the Mishnah said, I'm not using the word oistrus, because oistrus sounds like it chops an erva. It creates a new mitzias of an erva, and that's not really what's happening. All it is it's poitros. Oh, poitros is a giveaway. Poitros means, we're talking about there's a mitzvah, and now with poitros there's no mitzvah. Right? What does p'tur mean? I've been put for the mitzvah. So now I know we're dealing in b'makom mitzvah. We're dealing in the context of the Yevamos. Now it's very, very clear that Tzaras Erva is only a sugi when you learn the Masechtas Yevamos. So push to make it clear that the din Tzaras Erva is only true in Yevamos, but there's no such Erva called Tzaras Erva anywhere else. The Tana of the Mishnah used language that's not the best language. The Tana of the Mishnah knew, ganz good, that it could have used a sharper word, a word that would have been more descriptive. But he was a little bit afraid to use that word because he thought people might walk away from the first Mishnah Yevamos thinking that there's something called Tzaras Erva, and that's an Erva in all walks of life. So to make sure that people would realize that it's only an Erva in the face of a mitzvah's Yibum, it used a word that clearly gives away the fact that we're discussing a Makkah mitzvah, and that's the word poitros. That's why the time of the Mishnah used poitros, even though it's true. It's not just poitros, it's also oistros, because the moment there's no mitzvah of Yibum with an Erva and with a Tzaras Erva, it's actually going to be also to do Yibum because of the Isser Eshazach. So another question. So again, the time of the Mishnah is mentioning the basic halacha that an Erva, Tzaras Erva is going to be potter from Yibum and Chalitza. So the Gemara's kash is, why did the Mishnah have to mention that it's potter from Yibum and Chalitza? Why couldn't the Mishnah just say it's potter from Yibum? And I would know that it's potter from Chalitza as well. Just say that it's poitros min Yibum. It shouldn't even have to mention Chalitza. The Gemara says, Yibum had only said min Yibum. I would have thought Chalitza. Maybe it's taka potter from Yibum, but maybe there is a mitzvah of Chalitza. Now you would have thought Yevumi lo'miyah, and it's only Yibum that you don't have. Kamash Malan, Tana Mishnah wanted to make it clear that there's no Yibum, and if there's no Yibum, there's also no Chalitza, because the Tana is very subtly laying out all the asaitis of Yevamos here. What's the reason? Why, if there's no Yibum, is there no Chalitza? Because that's the rule. Anyone that has Yibum has Chalitza. Anyone that doesn't have Yibum doesn't have Chalitza. And the Svara is just read the Psukim in the Torah. Right? That's the Pashup Shad. The Pasuk says, what is Chalitza? If you don't want to do Yibum, then there's Chalitza. Okay, I couldn't do Yibum. It's not shot the person didn't want to, he didn't have a mitzvah yibum. So if he didn't have a mitzvah yibum, therefore, by definition, there won't be chalitza either. And as we mentioned in the introduction to the daf, and Rashi speaks it out over here as well, even though we're going to see that there are many cases where the halacha is going to be chayletzes, Yevamos, which is a contradiction to this rule of but every single time you have a chayletzes, there's going to be a pshat in it, and we're going to have to get into it. It's up to Gemara Vayik. Listen to Yibum and a chalitza. Why did the Mishnah mention doesn't it sound out of order? It should have mentioned first Yibam, then Chalitza. Why is it in a Chalitza min Yibam? Inami, or even better, speak B'lashon K'tzara. It should have just said in a Chalitza L'chuda. Just say you put them in a Chalitza. Why do you even mention Yibam? You can't say you put them in a Yibam and not Chalitza, because then you'll make a mistake. You'll think maybe there's Yibam, there's no Chalitza. But say you put them from Chalitza. If there's no Chalitza, the Gemara says, for sure you would know that there's no Yibam either. So the Gemara says, you want to know what the reason is? Abisholi. Because the Tana of Mishna is Abishol, the Amar who said, in the introduction to the Masechta, right? The Kaman Daf Lamed Tes, mitzvahs chalitza kedemus mitzvahs yibum. Abishol holds that chalitza kedemus yibum. The reason is because Abishol held that the only time you can be mekayim the mitzvah of yibum and not get involved in the iser eshesach and potential manzleiros is if the person had the proper kavanah when he did yibum. But if a person doesn't have the proper kavanah when he does yibum, so then the halacha is that it can be a problem, and that's why Abishol said we encourage people to do chalitza and not to do yibum. So to make the point that we encourage people to do chalitza over yibum, mitzvahs chalitzas kedemus mitzvahs yibum. That's why the Mishnah mentioned Yibum and Chalitza, and in the order of Chalitza first and Yibum second. Like this is going to be very, very clear to anyone reading the Mishnah. It sounds like Chalitza is more chashuv than Yibum. So when we mention in a Chalitza and a Yibum, push it to make it very, very clear. So the Gemara fact. The Mishnah mentioned Chamesh Esrei Nashim. Chamesh Esrei is a number. We count it, right? We count it. So the Gemara, why the Tana Mishnah have to count? We can't count ourselves. 15. We can count. Why does the Mishnah have to mention it's 15? And then the Gemara says, why did the Mishnah have to count it a second time? Now, the truth is, if you go through the Mishnah didn't count it a second time. The Mishnah mentions 15 once. It doesn't mention 15 twice. What the Mishnah does do is, after it mentions the 15 arayos, top line of Beis Amud Beis, it says, Harei elu poitroi sorei seim, v'tsorei sorei seim, min hachalitza min hayibim natzoi fo'im. Harei elu. Rashi says, Harei elu is mashma elu v'suloi. It sounds like we're counting. It's these 15 and no more. But the bottom line is in the ratio, it's mefurish, it's explicit. Chamesh Esrei. And then again, there's another reference in the Sefer. Just to explain the question, from the fact that we're counting, it sounds like we're trying to make it clear. It's 15. It's Harei Elu. It's these 15, right? It sounds like you would have thought maybe there's another one that should be included in this mission. No, there is no other one. It's only these 15. So the Gemara wants to know, what's that other one that you would have had a Havamina would have been included in the Mishnah? So the Gemara says, "Lemuute de Rav u'deravasi." It's coming to me, Mayet, the halacha of Rav and the halacha of Ravasi. So the Gemara doesn't even explain who Rav and who Ravasi is. So thankfully we have Rashi. And Rashi tells us who Rav and Ravasi is. And Rashi sends us knee deep into two of the major sugyas that we're going to learn. Metzachem and the coming daf in here in Masechtas Yevamos. So just to mention the words, obviously we're not going to go into it right now. Rav Lekaman is going to say one of the most important lines in the Masechta, and that is that Tzara Soita is Asura. So what's a Tzara Soita? A Tzara Soita is what Reuven and Shimon are brothers. Reuven has two wives. One of Reuven's wife was Mizana. She was Mizana, B'mezid. The halacha is she's a Soita. Reuven is not allowed to live with her. Reuven has to give her a get, but Reuven didn't give her a get. He did. He was supposed to, but he didn't. And then Reuven died and left over no children. So that Reuven's Yevamos, who's a Soita, and the other woman both fell a Yibam L'Shem. The halacha is, Rav said, that Tzara Soita Asura. That just like an Erva doesn't fall the Yibam V'Chalitza, a Soita is treated like an Erva. She doesn't fall the Yibam V'Chalitza either. And just like an Erva patters the Tzara from Yibam V'Chalitza, so too the Soita is also going to patter the Yibam from is also going to patter from Yibam V'Chalitza. That's Rav's halacha of Tzara Soita. What's Rav Asi? Rav Asi said a similar halacha related to a Tzaras Islandess. Reuven and Shimon are brothers. Reuven has two wives. One was an islandess. An islandess is a woman that can't have children, but a woman where Chazal deemed the marriage to be a mekach tois in the event that the man says that had I known she was an islandess, I would have never married her. Reuven had one wife, an islandess. The other wife was not an islandess. Then Reuven died, left over no children. The halach is the islandess has no Yibam V'Chalitza. And the islandess, being that she has no Yibam V'Chalitza, she patters the Tzara. The Tzara has a bit of a Tzaras islandess, and there's also no Yibam V'Chalitza. So according to Rav and Rav Asi, in theory, we could have had two other cases mentioned in our Mishnah. We could have mentioned the Tzaras Soita as being number 16, and we could have mentioned the Tzaras islandess as being number 17. So just like we have Bita, etc., up until Kalasa, as mentioned, that's 15 notion that are Poitra Sorit saying the Tzaras and the Chalis V'Yiman Soifa. So in theory, we could have had a Tzaras Soita, we could have had a Tzaras islandess, Minyana the Reishna, Minyana the Sefer. It's coming, and we'll take two cases that weren't mentioned in the Mishna B'Davka. What are the two cases that weren't mentioned in the Mishna B'Davka? Rav and Rav Asi, Tzara Soita and Tzara Silence. Up to Gemara. Okay, Rav Asi, the Mutemai. Now Rav and Rav Asi, Lechura are not going to be mema'et Tzara Soita and Tzara Islanders from the Mishnah, right? Because they hold that the laws of the Mishnah of Poichoy Tzara Seim, but Tzara Seim and a Chalitz Menayibum do apply to a Tzara Soita, and they do apply to a Tzara Island. So obviously the minyana of the Mishnah is not coming lamute. Now you have to know why they weren't mentioned in the Mishnah. The Gemara is going to ask that question in a moment. But at the same time, the minyana is certainly not coming to be mamayit then. So if that's the case, the minyana is coming to be mamayit something. What is it coming to be mamayit? So the Gemara says, if Rav and Rav Asi both hold of each other, meaning if Rav, who holds Saras Soita Asura, also holds Saras Islandus Asura, and Rav Asi that holds Saras Islandus Asura also holds that Saras Soita Asura, that means they each have to come up with two. So then Chadal Lamutei Saras Mamenes, one is going to come, is going to be Mamayit Saras Mamenes, the Chadal Lamutei Saras Machzor Gushasa, and the other one is going to be Mamayit Saras Machzor Gushasa. This is Mamish Mayridik. We're like all in. So what's Saras Mamenes? Saras Mamenes is where again, Reuben and Shimon are brothers. Reuben has two wives. One of his wives was a Yesoima, but a Yesoima that was married not by her father, but rather by one of her other relatives, such as her brother or her mother, where the halach is that she's mikudeshes, but she's only mikudeshes midrabban. Now we know that a yisoyma that's mikudeshes midrabban, it can be memayin. That was mentioned very prominently on that base. If she wants, she could do miyan. At any point, she could tell her husband that I'm not interested in being married to you anymore, and as a result, she has a right to go and be memayin. She could refuse. She could leave her marriage. The halach is she could also be memayin on her yavam. What happens if you have a Yusoyma Ketana who's Mekudeshes Midrabanan, her husband dies and now she falls Yevamos? Just like she had the right to be Mamayin on the original marriage, she has a right to be Mamayin on the Zika and on the Mitzvah's Yibum, which is a Taitzah, it's a result of that original marriage. The halach is that if she is Mamayin, Tzaras Mamenes is also going to be Asura, it's not going to have a Din Yibum V'cha Litzna. Or at the very least, it's a Sugya later in the first parak. So the Gemara says that one of the minyanas is going to come tzaras mamenes. That you would have thought tzaras mamenes maybe should be poitrois tzaras seim, but tzaras seim and a chalitza minayibon at soifa oilam. Minyana the ratio, minyana the seifa. One of the minyanas is coming to mu'utei tzaras mamenes. That's not going to be included in this. And the other one's coming to mu'utei tzaras machzir grushas. That's talking about where a man was machzir grushas, where he wasn't allowed to. So if somebody divorces his wife, he's allowed to remarry her, unless she gets married to somebody else. If she gets married to somebody else, he's not allowed to remarry her anymore. In fact, it's a law in the Torah. It's called machzir grushas. The halacha is if Reuben and Shimon are brothers, Reuben had two wives. One of his wives, he was machzir grushas, the Isser, he wasn't allowed to. He had another wife as well. Then he dies, leaves over no children. So the halacha is that there's no yibam and chalitza on the machzir grushas. And once there's no yibam on the machzir grushas, there's also no yibam and chalitza on the tzar. According to the mandama that saras machzir grushas is asur. So talk to Gemara. You want to know what the minyan of the reish is lamute, what the minyan of the seif is lamute. It's coming lamute, tzaras soita, tzaras islands. And if you hold tzaras soita, tzaras islands, you do have the halacha of tzara. Said it's coming to Mamayit something else. What's coming to be Mamayit? It's going to be Mamayit tzaras mamenes, and it's going to be Mamayit tzaras machzir grushas. Now the only time you need to be Mamayit tzaras mamenes and tzaras machzir grushas is if you hold both tzaras soita and tzaras islands are us. Right? If tzaras soita and tzaras islands are both aser, so you can't use either the minyan of the reish or the minyan of the sefer. They're both not going to work. Right? Again, just this is not even hard. It's just a dot confusing. So minyan of the reish lemutei, minyan of the sefer lemutei. So the Gemara said one is lemutei tzaras soita, the other one's lemutei tzaras not tzaras islands. So the Gemara according to Rav and Rav Asi that hold tzaras soitas asur, tzaras islands asur. What's it coming to be mind? So the Gemara says if Rav and Rav Asi both hold of each other. Meaning the man that holds tzaras soita asura holds tzaras islandus asura, and the man that holds tzaras islandus asura holds tzaras soitas asura. So it comes out they each need to be memai too. Which two will they be memai? They'll be memai tzaras mamenes, and they'll be memai tzaras machzir grushas. And if they don't hold of each other, meaning Rav holds tzaras soitas asura, but it doesn't necessarily hold tzaras islandus asura. Rav Asi holds tzaras islandus asura, but it doesn't necessarily hold tzaras soitas asura. So then each one only needs to be memai one. So chadul muti the chabre. What is going to be memai the other ones? Meaning the one that holds tzaras soita asura, but doesn't hold tzaras islandus asura. So one of the minyanas will be memai tzaras islandus, and vice versa. The chadal lemute, and the other one will be memai oy tzaras mamenes, oy tzaras machzir grushas. But the bottom line is between these four, between tzaras soita, tzaras islandus, tzaras mamenes, tzaras machzir grushas, a little bit of cheshbon here, but we could figure out what exactly the time of the Mishnah was coming to be made. So the Gemara, one final point: the Rav ule Rav Asi listening. Rav and Rav Asi both hold Tzaras Soita Asura and Tzaras Eilanis Asura, respectively. And the time of the Mishnah is not being memayed. If the Tana Mishnah is not being memayed, obviously the Tana of the Mishnah holds that it's really included in the Mishnah. So if it's included in the halacha of the Mishnah, so I wasn't mentioned in the Mishnah. Certainly wasn't mentioned in the Mishnah. You want to know if the halacha of the Mishnah is true? Machlokes. If you hold the halacha of the Mishnah is true, it's mentioned in the Mishnah. So the Gemara gives a technical reason why not. If you she'einu b'tzaras tzara, because the Tana of the Mishnah wanted to mention chamesh esrei noshim, where you have the halacha that there's no yibum v'chalitza on the erva, there's no yibum v'chalitza on the Tzaras erva, and there's also no yibum v'chalitza on the tzaras erva. You don't have that by tzaras soita and by tzaras islands. You know why? Because by tzaras soita and by tzaras islands, there is no tzaras tzara. This is very easy Yevamos arithmetic. What is a tzaras tzara? A tzaras tzara is where there were three brothers. Reuven died. He left over two wives. One was an erva, one was a tzaras erva to one of the brothers, but not to the other brother. So the other brother went and did yibum with the tzaras erva. Then he died and left over two wives. The original tzaras erva and another wife. The other wife is the tzara of the tzaras erva. But the point is, you have a tzaras erva when there are three brothers. A man dies, leaves over two wives, where the wives are erva and tzaras erva to one of the brothers, but not erva and tzaras erva to the other brother. So the other brother is able to marry the tzaras erva, had another wife. That other wife is the tzara of the tzaras erva. But in the case of tzaras soita and tzaras islandess, even if there's three brothers or there's 10 brothers, the soita is going to be an erva to all the brothers, which means the tzara is going to be a tzaras erva to all the brothers. So it's never going to be gemot. It's never going to be possible to have a case of tzaras tzara. Because in the classic case of the Mishnah, the erva is a result of the relationship between the Yevama and the Yavam. Reuven was married to Shimon's daughter. Reuven was married to Shimon's wife's sister. Reuven was married to Shimon's daughter-in-law. Okay, there's an erva relationship to Shimon, the Yavam, but that's not to a Levi. And as a result, it's shaykh to have a case of tzaras tzara. But in the case of tzaras soita, the erva is mitzad the original ishus. The problem over here is that Reuven was married to a soita, and a soita has a din erva. Again, we didn't learn the sugi of tzaras soita. Yeah, we'll get there. But the point is, the erva is noiveya from Reuven's own marriage. So if Reuven is married to a soita, and as a result, the soita has a din of an erva, Shimon can't marry her, and Levi can't, and Yehuda can't, and all the brothers can't. So that this soita is going to be an erva to the whole mishpacha, and the tzara is going to be a tzara servant to the whole mishpacha. So it's never going to be possible for the other brother to go ahead and marry her. So it'll never be a case of tzaras erva. That's what the Tana of the Mishnah didn't mention. It's of course the halacha is true. Rav said tzaras soita asura. Rav Asi said tzaras islandess asura. And if that's the case, it's poitros tzaros same and a chalitz benayim. But it's not possible to have a case of tzaras soita. The Tana of the Mishnah is very precise. Right? Our Mishnah has been super precise. That's so far the spirit of everything that we've learned. Why this order, and why minyana dereishma, and why minyana deseifa, and why did we mention chalitza before yibum, and why did we say poitros? We could have said oisros, and why did we even mention chalitza in the first place? All we should have done was mention yibum. Right? We've gone through every single nuance. It's very precise. And one of the precision of the Mishnah is that we want all 15 arayos to be able, or all the arayos mentioned in the Mishnah, to be subject to the law of tzaras tzara. And it's not shaykh to have tzaras tzara by tzaras soita, tzaras islandess. It's for that reason it's not mentioned. Regardless, from here until the end of the Amud is super critical. I'm going to go through it quickly because the Gemara is going to go through it is going to happen quickly. But the point that we're going to now discover is why is it if an erva falls liyibum, is the halacha that there's no yibum, there's no chalitza? What's the makar to a tzaras erva? What's the makar to the now infamous tzaras erva? And a few other drushes that the Gemara now is going to bring. So the Gemara, how do we know the halacha of the Mishnah? The Tanna Rabbanan went to the Bryce. It says in the Torah, Isha al-achoyso lo-yisikach mitzvah le-galois ervasa aleh b'chayeh. So Pashut Pshat in the pasuk is, if a man is married, he's not allowed to marry his wife's sister. This is known as the erva of achas isha. Achas isha is an erva. Now, if you just look at the words of the Torah says, why can't a man marry his wife's sister? It's because when a man has two wives, the wives become tzaras to each other. which, by the way, ain't mikra yotzim they pshuta. They become tzaras to each other. And as a result, it's not okay, says the Torah, for a man to marry two sisters because you're going to be creating tzaras, sufficient shvestas between family. So it says, it's Pashup Shan, the Pasuk, Isha elachoisa loisikach litzra. Don't marry a woman and her sister because you're just going to cause fights. Because the reality is, two wives are tzaras to each other, and we don't want tzaras. So it says in Torah, Isha elachoisa loisikach litzra legalus avasa oleh b'chayel. So the Gemara says, if you go through this pasuk, there's one extra word, and the word that's extra is the word oleh. Oleh, not Talmud Levi. Why did it say in the pasuk oleha? We could have made the same exact point without saying the word oleh. Fish, because it says in the Torah about the mitzvah of Yibam, the words Yevamos Yaveh. I would have thought that the mitzvah of Yibam is true even by an Arab, right? Yevamos Yaveh. Anytime there's two brothers, one dies without children, you would have thought there's a mitzvah of Yibam, even if the Yevama is an Arab. So the Gemara, it says oleh by Achosisha. It says oleh by Yibam, not the mitzvah. Just like Yevamos Yaveh is talking about a mitzvah, so to the word oleh, and it says by Achis Ish in the Parashat Arayis, it's even b'makom mitzvah. V'amar and the Torah saying loisikach. That is an isser even b'makom mitzvah. So even b'makom mitzvah, still there's going to be an isser for a person to go ahead and marry an Achis Isha. So the Brayso Daita. Okay, so now I have the Makar. We know the source to the halacha of the beginning of the Masechta, which is that an erva does not have yibum v'chalitza. Says the Brayso Tzaras Minayin. How do you know the halacha of a tzaras erva? Talmud Loimar. It says in the pasuk litzra. It says v'ishna lachoisa loisikach litzra. What does litzra mean? Tzara. The context is achisisha, specifically oleh, which is b'makom yibum, and from here we learn that there's a halacha of tzaras erba b'makom yibum. Mainly tzaras. So I have a makar now. I have a makar to tzaras erba. Tzaras minayin. How do I know the halacha of tzaras erba? Talmud loyma litzroi v'loy. Could it say lotzor? It says litzroi with an extra resh, and that's coming to teach us that not only erba, not only tzaras erba, but even a tzaras erba. Mainly achisisha. Okay, so we have a makar now. Achisisha. There's no yibum. There's no chalitza. Not just achisisha, even the tzara and the tzara. How do you know all the other rice? Amud. So the Gemara says it's not that from achisisha is unique in what way? It's an erva. It's a chayavan alznein akaris. It's a chayvi krisos. If someone's mezana with an achisisha b'shoigig, just like if someone does any avera shechayvi krisos b'shoigig, malach is a chayvi min karmechatas. Sruly Bornstein is in yibum af kol sheyerva. So to any time there's a woman, a Yevamos that's an erva. Chayavan alznein akaris v'ashugas achatas. But there's a chiv karis and there's a chatas. The halach is Sruly Bornstein, there's going to be no yibum. Meaning, once I know achisisha, so it's pashut. I can learn all the other rights from achisisha. Why would it be any different? It's pashut. If I know by achisisha, it's a binyan av. It teaches me that would be true for all the other arayas as well. In the Elohei, and so he's saying, how do you know the tzaras erva of all the arayas as well? Meaning, I know tzaras erva by achisisha. How do I know tzaras shar arayas? The Gemara says the same regard. I'm not achisisha mechedy erva v'chayavamos then it cards v'ashul glas achatos Sruly Bornstein tzaras asura. Just like achisisha is an erva and it's karas and it's chatos and it's an isayibon. And this in tzaras achisisha of kolshi erva. The chayavan then it cards v'ashul glas achatos Sruly Bornstein tzaras asura. So there's no reason. It's the same limud. If it's true by achisisha erva and it's true tzaras erva, so too it's going to be true by shar arayas. It's from here that the Chachamim said, Chamesh Esrei Noshim, Poitroi Sareiseyem, Tzoroi Sareiseyem, Min HaChalitza, Umin HaYibum, Natzoifa. This is the Makar to the words of the Anshe Knesset Agdoila, which I mentioned at the beginning of Masechtas Yevamos, the Chamesh Esrei Noshim. This is the Makar. But the Brayso continues. You would think that maybe we should be marba even the 6 arayos that are more chamor than the 15 arayas that were mentioned in our Mishnah. That maybe there too, the tzaros should be awesome. So what are the 6 arayas that are not mentioned in our Mishnah that are even more chamor than the arayas mentioned in our Mishnah? So the truth is, this is the rest of the story. It's not mentioned in our Mishnah, but it's mentioned in the next Mishnah, Daf Yud Gimel Amud Aleph. So if you turn to Daf Yud Gimel Amud Aleph, Sheish arayos chamuros me'ed. There are 6 arayos that are quote unquote chamuros me'ed. Mepnei shenesuyois la'acherim tzareiseyem mutares. And the Mishnah mentions the 6: Imoy ve'eshes aviv, achis aviv, the point of those 6 arayas is they're arayas just like the 15 arayas mentioned in our Mishnah. However, the law of our Mishnah doesn't apply. The reason the law of our Mishnah doesn't apply is because those 6 arayas can't fall the yibum. And the halacha of our Mishnah, like we made a big deal about in Amud Aleph, is only Nageya Yibum. The whole concept of Tzaras Erva is when she falls the Yibum. However, if Reuben and Shimon were not brothers, and Reuben was married to one of Shimon's Arayas and also had another wife and then died, if Shimon wants to marry the other wife, he's allowed to. There's no problem. It's only if they're brothers and there's Yibum, then there's halacha of Tzaras Erva. But to the extent that there's no Yibum, then there's no halacha of Tzaras Erva. So those 6 Arayas are Arayas that it would be impossible for them to fall a Yibum. The reason is because just like those 6 Arayas are Arayas to Shimon, they're also Arayas to Reuven. Reuven and Shimon are brothers, so it's very likely that they're going to share cousins, right? They're mishpacha. So as a result, they're going to have common relatives. So those 6 Arayas were Shimon's Arayas and Reuben's Arayas. Remember, Reuben could never marry this woman. If Reuben said Arayas Kodesh and Sleep, the Kedusha wouldn't be typhus. As the result, there's no Nefilu Yibum. If there's no Nefilu Yibum, so this is all dead on arrival. It's not possible for it to happen. So if this can't happen, so it's never going to be again. So really, what the Mishna is saying then on Daf Yud Gimel Amud Aleph is that the only time there's halacha of Tzaras Erva is b'makom Yibum. But Shaloi b'makom Yibum, this halacha is not going to be again. And just to speak out one point that Tosfos speaks out here in Daf Gimel Amud Beis, we're skipping the real Lamdash Tosfos is for now. But just to speak out one Tosfos that's negay the Pashup Shad, and that is that the Mishnah and the Gemara here is using the Sheisha Rayas Chamuris as the example of a Tzaras Erva Shaloi b'makom mitzvah. By the Sheisha Arayas, it's not possible in the Filu Yibum. So if there's a Tzaras Erva by those Arayas, by definition, it's Shaloi b'makom mitzvah. But really, the halacha that there's no Tzaras Erva Shaloi b'makom mitzvah is true even for the Chamesh Esrei Noshim that are mentioned in our Mishnah. Our Mishnah mentioned Chamesh Esrei Noshim, and they are Poitros Tzaresei. They're only Poitros Tzaresei b'makom mitzvah. What would be, for example, if Reuben and Shimon were brothers, and Reuben was married to Shimon's daughter, and he had another wife, but he also had children, and then he died. Shimon can marry the tzara. The only time you have the halacha of tzaras erva is b'makom yibum, b'makom mitzvah. The sheish nashim is always going to be shalai b'makom mitzvah. So it's just very easy to use them as an example. It's just a convenient way for Chazal to say that it's shalai b'makom mitzvah. Maybe there's no halacha of tzaras erva. But even the chamesh esrei nashim that do potentially fall a yibum, but in the event they didn't fall a yibum, for example, the man had children, so then it's pasha, you wouldn't have the halacha of tzaras erva either. But either way, Zok the Gemara, this is the makar to really the Mishnah and Daf Yud Gimel Amud Aleph. So Zok the Gemara, Yachal, you would have thought that so too the sheish nashim that are chamuris me'elu shiur tzaras masuros that maybe they too there should be halacha of tzaras erva amrid. So we say no. Why not? Because what's the makar to tzaras erva achis isha? It's ma'achis ishta miucheda she erva. It's possible for Reuven to marry Shimon's wife's sister. So Achos Isha is a marriage, it's a situation, it's an erva that can result in Yibum. It's Vir Vasura Liyabim, Vitzarosa Asura. There you have the halach of Tzara, of Kol Shi Erva. V'chayavan al Zayna Kares, V'ashigigasa Chatas, V'efshali Nasi La'achim, Asur Liyabim, Tzarasa, Asura, Yotsu, Sheish Arayis, Chamuris Mielo, as opposed to these 6, Hayol the Efshali Nasi La'achim, being that they can never be married to the brother. It's always shaloi b'makom mitzvah. So tzara is saying mutaros. The tzara is going to be mutter. Why? She'in tzara el me'ach. Because the tzara is only me'ach, and we have to speak out Tosfos Knech. Not only me'ach. It's only me'ach and only b'makom mitzvah, where the brother died with no children. But if there's no yibum, there's not going to be halacha of tzara serva. So the Gemara, this up until this point, we found the kairos to the halacha of erva b'makom yibum and tzara serva and tzara serva azara shaman. But we have a makar that is an isser. The makar was, it says in the Torah, Isha lachoisa lo yisikach mitzvah. The galus of asal labachaya lo yisikach is an isser. So we know there's an isser. Azara shamanu. We know the isser. Oynish minayin. What's the makar to the oynish? So the Gemara says Amakra. It says in the Torah, Ki kol ashe yaseh mikol atoyeva yisoela v'nichrusu anafoshes oises mikerav am. It says in the Torah that anyone that's going to violate any one of the toyeva yisoela, any one of the toyevas that were mentioned in the parish of the Arayis, they're going to get chorus. Where was the halach of erva b'makom yibum mentioned? In the parish of Arayis. Where was tzaras erva mentioned? In the parish of Arayis. Where was tzaras erva mentioned? In the parish of Arayis. Anything mentioned in the parish of Arayis has no yibum, it has an oynish of chorus, and if there's an oynish of chorus, so that's how you know that there's going to be an oynish of chorus here as well. So again, what's the makar to the halach of the Mishnah? do you know that there's no Yom Chalitza by an Erev? How do you know there's no Yom Chalitza by a Tzoras Erev, by a Tzoras Erev? It's learned out from Psukim. It's learned out from the Parsha of Arayis. It's in Parshas Achrivos. It's learned out from which Erev? Achlis Isha. These are mamish b'yisoides, the Aleph Beis of Yevamos. It's learned out from Achlis Isha. What does it say in Achlis Isha? One extra word. Which word? Oleha. Oleha sends us right to Kiseitse, right to Yevamos. Yevamo Yava Oleha. And that teaches me that just like there's a Parsha Arayis, ordinarily, even the Makam Yevamo Yava Oleha, still there's going to be a Parsha Arayis. How do I know the halach of Tzaras Erva? Because in that pasuk where it says Oleha, it says Isha lachoisa loisikach litzror. Litzror is talking about Tzara, and then it says Oleha, which means B'macham Yivam. So we know the halacha of Tzaras Erva. How do I know Tzara? It could have said Latzur, it says Litzror. So we have a makar for Erva, we have a makar for Tzaras Erva, we even have a makar for Tzaras Erva. We're going to stop here. That's Hashem. Tomorrow, we're going to segue into one of the most important sugis in Shas, certainly from a rape perspective. That is the sugi of Asei Doicha Loisase. So the sugi of Asei Doicha Loisase is tucked away, literally, in the beginning of Masechtas Yevamos. It's several dafin. It's very, very geschmacke dafin, many, many different levels. So we're going to start touching on some of the Yevamos lamdas, some real Shas lamdas, as Hashem coming in the next few days.